Usually when we talk about investing, um, getting a 7, maybe an 8% return feels like a massive win.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. But imagine if you were handed a financial prospectus that guaranteed for every single dollar you put into this specific strategy, you would save $7 down the line. I mean, a 7-to-1 return on investment.
I mean, it's the kind of math that would have venture capitalists practically breaking down the door to get in on the ground floor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But we aren't looking at some, Silicon Valley pitch deck today. We are looking at global warfare, diplomacy, and the literal devastating cost of human conflict. So welcome to this deep dive into our sources today, where we are unpacking a really fascinating shift happening right now in the summer of 2026.
It really is a wild pivot.
It is. And on the table, we have a thick stack of recent diplomatic statements from the UN, the European Union, various foreign ministries, and we also have a dispatch from the Atlantic Council think tank, and an analytical brief from a mediation institute.
Yeah, and it is a genuinely remarkable stack of materials, mostly because it captures this real-time, very aggressive pivot in how the world's most powerful institutions are handling international security.
Right, and our mission for this deep dive is to explore exactly why the world's top diplomats are suddenly rebranding early mediation as this hard-nosed security strategy.
Which is a huge departure from the norm.
Huge. We are going to look at the mechanics of how it actually works, how it occasionally backfires in spectacular fashion, and this is crucial for you listening, how this exact same geopolitical playbook applies to resolving disputes in your own workplace, your neighborhood, or your family.
All right.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with where this wild 7-to-1 math is actually coming from.
Right. So historically, mediation and peacebuilding, they've been viewed through a very moral lens.
Like a charity project.
Exactly. It was considered the right thing to do. Soft power, a project run by idealists, basically. But what we are seeing across these 2026 sources is a complete structural reframing. That soft power is now being treated as a cold, calculated economic necessity.
You really see the curtain pulled back on this.
Yeah.
During the June 16, 2026 UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs donor meeting.
Right. That was a key moment.
Yeah, Nepal's UN ambassador, Lok Bahadur Thapa, he gave this presentation where the core thesis was essentially that early investment in prevention is far more effective and exponentially cheaper than scrambling to respond to a conflict after it has already erupted.
And the European Union actually brought the receipts to back that up just a few days later on June 25th.
Oh, the UN Peacebuilding Week.
Yes, exactly. During that week, the EU's representative, Peter Wagner, he presented these internal reviews of the UN's peacebuilding architecture, and those reviews proved the math.
The 7-to-1.
The 7-to-1. For every single dollar invested in prevention, the international community saves $7 in post-conflict reconstruction.
Which really puts into perspective why the EU has poured over 630 million euros into the peacebuilding fund. I mean, they aren't writing those checks just for the optics.
No, not at all. Defense planners and finance ministers are, they're finally looking at the hospital bill for a war, so to speak.
Right.
Because when a city is bombed out, you aren't just paying for bullets, you are paying to rebuild power grids. You're managing disrupted global supply chains.
Decades of refugee crisis management.
Exactly. So sending a dedicated mediation team to a tense region to, facilitate dialogue for 6 months, that is literal pennies on the dollar compared to funding a localized war.
It reminds me so much of preventative healthcare. Like for decades, diplomatic mediation was treated like an emergency room visit for a massive heart attack.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. You only do it when the patient is coding, the sirens are blaring, everything is falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
But what these foreign ministries are arguing for now is treating mediation like daily blood pressure medication.
Let's actually follow that analogy because it gets to the core of the strategy. If you miss one day of blood pressure medication, you don't instantly have a heart attack.
Right. The damage is invisible.
Exactly. It is the prolonged neglect that causes the arterial plaque to build up. And in diplomacy, that plaque is unresolved historical grievance, economic disparity, political marginalization.
So what does that daily medication actually look like in practice for a diplomat, though?
Well, it looks like embedding mediation directly into defense planning right from the start, rather than, keeping it as this glass box you break only when the military stalls out.
Oh, like the Al Jazeera op-ed from our stack.
Yes, the January 2026 one.
Written jointly by the foreign ministers of Qatar and Norway, I think?
That's the one. They argue that mediation is no longer a, quote, moral nicety, They are urging the international community to adopt a formal mediation-first doctrine.
Which means what exactly? On the ground.
It means funding local civil society groups, keeping constant back-channel communications open, and addressing resource disputes before anyone even thinks about picking up a weapon.
Okay, so the financial logic sounds bulletproof in a boardroom in Geneva or New York.
Mm.
7-to-1 return, daily diplomatic medication. It all makes theoretical sense.
Yeah.
But when you are looking at these sources, the glaring question is, does a spreadsheet actually matter when the bullets start flying?
Right, the reality check.
Yeah. Is there historical proof that bringing people to a table early actually alters the course of a war?
Well, the sources do provide several historical case studies that demonstrate it does work, but only if we understand the mechanics of how the table is set.
Because it's not just guys in suits.
No, it is rarely just two politicians in suits shaking hands.
Right, like the sources highlight Mozambique in 1992 as this massive turning point. I mean, you had 16 years of brutal civil war there, 1 million people dead, 4 million people
It's
displaced.
just staggering numbers.
And the peace agreement wasn't brokered by some massive UN military coalition. It was mediated by a Catholic lay group, the community of Sant'Egidio.
And what's fascinating here is the mechanism behind that success. Why did a Catholic lay group succeed where traditional diplomats completely failed?
Because they were actually there.
Yes, because Sant'Egidio had spent years on the ground building deep, localized trust. They weren't flying in on a private jet to dictate terms. They understood the daily realities of the people fighting.
He actually had a relationship with them.
Exactly. They provided a neutral, culturally respected space where the warring factions felt safe enough to actually air their grievances without the immediate threat of arrest or assassination.
The sources also point to Tunisia as a masterclass in this kind of non-traditional intervention. Like in 2013 and 2014, the tensions following the Arab Spring Revolution were boiling over.
It was incredibly volatile.
Political assassinations were happening. The country was teetering right on the brink of a full-blown civil war.
And the political class was entirely deadlocked. I mean, they could not speak to one another without the conversation turning violent. So 4 civil society groups, the National Dialogue Quartet, stepped in.
Right, and this wasn't the government.
No, this was a labor union, a confederation of industry, a human rights league, and an order of lawyers.
Wait, lawyers and labor unions, they basically forced an inclusive nationwide dialogue because they held the actual levers of everyday society.
Exactly. They managed to break the deadlock because they represented the actual functioning of the country.
Mm-hmm.
If the labor unions and the lawyers refuse to participate in a war, it is very, very hard for politicians to wage one.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, they drafted a roadmap that led to an interim government and a new constitution, ultimately winning the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize for it. They averted a war by physically altering who was allowed to sit at the negotiating table before the violence reached a point of no return.
We also see Nepal mentioned in the 2006 Comprehensive Peace Accord, which ended a decade-long civil war, abolished the monarchy, and integrated former combatants into the political system. But reading through the fine print of our source stack, I really have to push back on this narrative a bit. It feels a little too triumphant.
In what way?
Well, the sources themselves admit that Nepal's justice process still faces massive unresolved challenges today. I mean, 20 years later.
Yeah.
And in Tunisia, that new constitution required agonizing ongoing work. And their political situation today remains incredibly fragile. So it begs the question, are these early mediations actually solving the root conflicts, or are we just freezing them in place? Like, are we just hitting a pause button hoping for the best?
That's a very fair critique. And the Mediation Institute brief in our stack addresses this directly. The experts readily admit that early mediation agreements do not create instant utopias.
Right.
You cannot magically erase centuries of ethnic or economic grievance with a signed piece of paper. The immediate goal is simply to alter the trajectory away from catastrophic violence.
So it's like applying a tourniquet to stop the bleeding before you attempt the surgery.
Yes, exactly. And the surgery is the post-accord follow-through. A frozen conflict will rapidly unfreeze if the follow-through is weak.
Which makes sense.
Right, so success requires international support, robust disarmament programs, and crucially, integrating that local civil society into the long-term governance. Not just handing power back to the traditional elites who started the war in the first place.
So mediation buys you the time, but you still have to put in the work.
It buys you the time and the space to walk a new path, but you still have to put in the grueling work of walking it.
Which brings us to the more sobering half of our deep dive. Because the sources show us that when that follow-through fractures, or when the mediation window closes entirely, the relapses are just devastating.
They really are.
We are seeing recent instances where ceasefires shatter and the mediators themselves end up in the crosshairs.
And this concept of the closing window is absolutely critical to understanding the current geopolitical landscape.
The sources mention Colombia as a prime example of where this fell apart. What exactly happened there with the ELN rebel group?
So in June 2023, the Colombian government and the ELN signed a bilateral ceasefire. And it was celebrated globally as this massive milestone in President Gustavo Petro's total peace campaign.
And it worked at first, right?
It did. The violence initially dropped. But by early 2024, the entire agreement collapsed amid renewed mistrust, accusations of violated terms, and a failure to implement the deeper societal changes that the ceasefire was supposed to enable.
The underlying plaque hadn't been cleared.
Right, the plaque was still there, so the heart attack resumed.
And the sources draw parallel to the Gaza ceasefire from January to March of 2025, which paused fighting and freed hostages for 6 weeks, but ultimately failed to secure an extension, leading to resumed hostilities.
Yes, and this specific dynamic where the pause button fails to hold it leads to a severe phenomenon documented in a dispatch from the Atlantic Council that we really need to look at closely.
Okay, let me jump in here, because that Atlantic Council dispatch by Aziz Al-Ghasshan from March 2026 focuses heavily on the geopolitics of the Middle East. Now, as we get into this, we want to be completely clear with you listening. Our goal here is entirely impartial. We aren't taking a side or endorsing any specific viewpoint on the Gaza-Iran conflicts or the broader regional politics.
Right, absolutely.
We are strictly reporting the analysis of statecraft and the historical timelines, exactly as they are laid out in the Atlantic Council dispatch and the other provided materials. Our focus is the mechanics of the diplomacy itself under extreme pressure.
And it is a necessary boundary to set, because the analysis in this dispatch deals with the raw, often very dangerous reality of what happens when states attempt to mediate highly kinetic conflicts.
The dispatch outlines a severe, real-time backlash against this whole mediation-first doctrine. It details how Gulf states, specifically Oman and Qatar, who have historically been massive hubs for regional dialogue, are suddenly finding the role of mediator highly, quote, unappealing.
Yeah.
So why are the world's go-to mediators suddenly stepping back?
Because the very act of hosting the dialogue brought violence directly to their doorsteps.
Wow.
During the Gaza-Iran negotiations, both Qatari and Omani territories were physically struck. The Atlantic Council analysis warns that regional diplomacy is rapidly waning because these actors are recalculating their own physical security.
I mean, you can't really blame them.
Exactly. When the act of talking makes you a target, states lean back toward military posturing and force rather than dialogue.
So how does the UN or the EU maintain a mediation-first doctrine when the mediators are literally getting bombed?
Well, it is the ultimate stress test of everything we've talked about. And the sobering reality the sources point to is that mediation only works reliably early.
Before things get too hot.
Right. It works before trust completely evaporates and before a conflict devolves into a zero-sum game of absolute survival. Once a conflict reaches a certain thermal temperature, the window for calm, structured conversations slams shut.
Because the psychology of the actors fundamentally changes.
Entirely. When bombs are falling on your cities and survival is your only metric of success, the patience required to sit at a table and discuss nuanced historical grievances vanishes.
The diplomatic off-ramp becomes invisible.
Yes. That is exactly why the EU is pleading for early funding. You have to catch the spark while it is still just a spark, because once the entire forest is engulfed in a crown fire, sending in negotiators is just putting firefighters in the path of the flames.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we look at the analytical brief from the Mediation Institute in our stack, they take this exact same macro geopolitical dynamic, this shrinking window for structured conversation, the cost of delayed intervention, and they map it directly onto our daily lives.
It is a brilliant pivot in the material, because while the scale of a global war is vastly different, the mechanical nature of human conflict remains surprisingly consistent.
Yeah, it really does.
Whether you are dealing with heavily armed nation-states or two neighbors sharing a property line.
The brief is titled Strategic Necessity. And the core argument is that if timing is everything in global diplomacy, the exact same math applies to you and me.
Yeah.
You don't need a UN mandate to utilize this. Think about a really toxic team dynamic at your workplace. One everyone is avoiding because it's awkward. The sources are basically arguing that by avoiding a slightly uncomfortable 10-minute coffee chat today, You are guaranteeing a 6-month HR nightmare tomorrow.
And the costs of that are real. If you resolve an office tension in week 1, the cost is a cup of coffee.
Right.
If you wait until positions calcify, the costs become exponential. You're looking at official HR investigations, massive drops in team productivity, legal fees, and the staggering financial cost of employee turnover. You missed the early window, and now you are paying for post-conflict reconstruction.
I was reading this and immediately thought about localized commercial disputes. Like, two businesses disagree over a deliverable in a contract. If they bring in a neutral third party early, they might save the deal.
Absolutely.
But if they wait, it goes to brutal bridge-burning litigation. To me, taking a business dispute to court is basically the micro version of international militarization.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy holds up perfectly. In litigation, you are spending an absolute fortune. You are mutually destroying the ongoing relationship, and you are handing your autonomy over to a third party with a gavel, hoping you win a zero-sum game.
Both the lawsuit and the military strike are the direct result of missing the early mediation window.
Exactly. Whether it is Peter Wagner managing a €630 million EU peacebuilding fund to stabilize a fragile region, or just a manager pulling two feuding employees into a room before a project collapses, the underlying philosophy is identical.
Yeah.
It requires timing, it requires integrity, and it requires preventing people from seeing each other strictly as enemies.
The Institute brief lays out 3 specific policy recommendations that map perfectly from the global to the personal level. First, build dedicated funding and time for early intervention. Don't wait for the crisis to demand your attention. Schedule the check-ins.
Second, make dialogue the default rather than the absolute last resort. It should be your first operational move, not your Hail Mary pass when everything else has failed.
And third, ensure you bring the right people into the room. Just like Tunisia needed labor unions and lawyers, not just deadlocked politicians to break their civil war, a workplace dispute might need peers or neutral colleagues, not just a heavy-handed executive, to find a sustainable solution.
The geopolitical stakes might involve millions of lives, but the human element scales down perfectly. We all have a specific window where we are willing to listen and adjust.
But it closes.
Right. Once survival mode kicks in or ego takes over, that window closes, and the cost of resolving the issue skyrockets.
So what does this all mean? If we pull all these threads together, we're looking at a world where the highest levels of global diplomacy have finally realized that early mediation isn't just a soft moral charity project. It is a highly economical, strategic imperative.
Yeah, the math is undeniable.
We have seen that it has real limits, that follow-through is agonizingly difficult, and that the physical dangers are incredibly high when trust is entirely gone and the conflict runs too hot. But the core truth remains undeniable. Bringing people to the table early, before the point of no return, saves massive amounts of time, money, and most importantly, human relationships.
It represents a profound shift in how we calculate the cost of our interactions. And as we wrap up this analysis, I think there's a powerful way to apply this directly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Building on that EU metric of a guaranteed 7-to-1 return on investment for conflict prevention, I would challenge you listening to do a quick audit of your own life or your organization.
Okay.
How would you calculate the personal ROI of a conflict you successfully avoided this year by addressing it early? And conversely, what hidden post-conflict reconstruction costs are you currently paying for a localized dispute, a fractured friendship, a toxic team dynamic, a neighborhood rivalry that you allowed to escalate past the point of dialogue?
That is a brilliant question to leave off on, and something we should all probably spend a little time thinking about. Because the math always catches up with us, one way or another. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. Keep asking questions, keep looking for that early window for dialogue, and stay curious. We'll catch you next time.